Welcome back to Youth Group, everyone. Welcome to our lessons for this semester, this lesson for tonight. And as we start, I want to ask you a question. I want you to use your imagination, put yourselves in this scenario. Can you imagine what it must have been like at the Last Supper? Can you imagine these last few hours that Jesus had with his disciples? See, this was actually a normal meal that Jesus and his disciples would have had. This was the Passover feast. This was the Passover Seder that Jesus and his disciples were sitting down to, and they would have done this every year. But this one was different. Jesus knew that this one was different, that this one was his last one. And I've got to wonder if he was kind of tweaking out a little bit. You know, it says later that when he was in the garden that he was so stressed to the point that his sweat became like blood. So I imagine he was a little bit stressed about what was coming. And he knew that when he sat down for this meal. And I think it's fair because imagine what you would want to say, how you would act, how you would react if you knew that your life was coming to an end. Would you speak differently? Would you act differently? I think it's fair to assume that we would. And therefore, I think it's fair to assume that Jesus was a little bit too. And I imagine that there was this tension in the room. And you've got to believe that the disciples had a little bit of awareness to it. Maybe just a little. I don't want to give them too much credit. But this semester, we're going to be studying this last supper that Jesus had with his disciples in a series called 5 Hours, based off of a teaching series and a book by Sinclair B. Ferguson called Lessons from the Upper Room. We're going to be taking a look back at this Last Supper from the perspective of the Gospel of John. So let's start there. Now, before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart of this earth to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a bowl, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around his waist. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, do you wash my feet?" Jesus answered him, "What I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand." Peter said to him, "You shall never wash my feet." But Jesus answered, "If I do not wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "The one who has bathed does not need to wash, except for his feet, but is completely clean. And you are clean, but not every one of you." For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, "Not all of you are clean." So I said already that this Passover Seder would have been a normal thing for Jesus and his disciples to do, but clearly this one started out a little bit different. This one started out with Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, which many of you already know was the job of a servant. This was not an honorable thing for a leader to do, for a rabbi to do. This was atypical. This probably never happened before. So it didn't match with the pattern of a typical Passover feast. But what it does match is the pattern of John's gospel and the pattern of Jesus' life. See, if you put this passage together with the gospel of John, but also with the book of Philippians, specifically chapter 2, you can clearly see that this isn't atypical. It's weird for the Passover feast, but this is actually how Jesus lived his life. right? So we see Jesus' origin, right? In John 1, it tells us that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. In Philippians 2, it says, though he was in the form of God. And here in John, it says, Jesus, knowing that he had come from God, right? We see where he is. We see who he is. We see where he's from. And we see this humiliation, right? In Philippians, we see that he emptied himself. In John, it says that he stepped into his creation. We also see that in Genesis, by the way. John is an echo of Genesis, in case you didn't know that already. And here we see that Jesus stepped out of his seat of honor and disrobed and knelt down by his disciples. And we see salvation, right? We see that in John, we see that he came into the world to save it. In Philippians, it said that he became obedient to the point of death upon the cross. And in John, in this physical, actually happening parable, we see Jesus washing his disciples' feet. We see him cleansing his disciples of their sins. Then we see the exaltation. We don't see this quite in Genesis because it's the whole scripture, but we do see it in Revelation, right? We see it in the end of this, and in John we see it as Jesus stands back up. He's finished washing his disciples' feet. We see him stand up, put his robe back on, and retake his seat of honor. And then in Philippians it says, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every name. Right after we see that Jesus rose again from the dead, we see him ascend into heaven and take the right seat of God back. He takes the seat that is rightfully his back. He goes back to where he was, where he had stepped out of, where he had humbled himself from. So while this was a strange occurrence as far as Passover feasts go, if you go to a Passover feast, you're not going to see this happen. Well, maybe if it's a born again Jew that's presenting it, I don't know, maybe. But that wasn't typical. But it was very typical of Jesus' life, and that's why we're studying this, because the things that were said in these last 5 hours, the things that were communicated by Jesus in this Last Supper that he had, they weren't out of left field. They weren't the only time he ever taught these lessons. And there are things that we need to see where he's re-emphasizing things, because we know that repetition is the mother of all learning. And there's a reason that God repeats things in the scripture, and it's because he wants us to pay attention. So this semester, we're going to be studying these last 5 hours. Tonight, we're going to be studying the washing of the disciples' feetsies. So as we start our discussion in our small groups tonight, and we're digging into to the 5 hours, and specifically tonight into the washing of the disciples' feet, I want us to enter into this time prayerfully seeking God's intentionality as Jesus uses this last meal with his disciples to the glory of God. And I pray that for your group tonight, that your conversation would be to the glory of God. So let's see what these last 5 hours have in store.